Welcome to Navigating Net Zero, where we explore the challenges and opportunities of taking climate action in the real world. Each episode, your host Alexia Kelly sits down with leading climate change professionals and experts for honest conversations about what it means to make net zero a reality. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in.
Welcome to Navigating Net Zero, the podcast where we explore what's working, what's not, and what's next on the global journey to net zero. I'm delighted to be joined here today by Dr. Lee Borkenhagen, who's a Senior Vice President at Environmental Defense Fund, or EDF, directing the EDF strategy to catalyze private sector action that accelerates the transition to net zero emissions, creates safer products, and feeds the world without warming the planet. Lee's leadership experience spans food, fashion, retail, tech, and the nonprofit sector, and has included roles at the Earthshot Prize, Nike, and Oxfam. She holds a doctorate in environmental science policy and management and was a Fulbright scholar in Côte d'Ivoire. And I'm excited to talk about that today because I didn't know that before today. So Lee, thank you so much for joining me.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you.
So I want to jump right into it and would love to hear a little more just about your career journey. And you've worked obviously in lots of different parts of the corporate and nonprofit space. So tell me a little bit about what drew you to sustainability work in the first place and how that journey's gone for you.
I grew up in London and my mum was in finance and my dad was in the oil industry. And funnily enough, despite their jobs, they actually really loved the outdoors and they would drag us wherever we went at the weekends outdoors. And I think that bug really kind of settled in me from an early age of liking being outside. And when I started at university, I was very fortunate to be in the setting where you can try a lot of different things. And so I tried a course on primate ecology and I fell in love. And I just wanted to follow orangutans around the forest as quickly as I possibly could. And I basically sat in a professor's office hours relentlessly for weeks and weeks and weeks on end until he agreed that I could be his research assistant out in Borneo. And I took off after sophomore year, so after my second year, and went to Indonesia and followed orangutans. But what was really clear really quickly was I wasn't very good at following orangutans. I wasn't really made out for like counting fruits on trees that were more than 100 feet tall. And I really was fascinated by what was going on around the forest. So how were people using the forest for harvest that they could have of various fruits and nuts and so on, but also how they were actually selling the wood. This was where I was starting to think, okay, how do markets change how people use resources? How do market decisions on a kind of individual by individual basis determine whether the forest stands or falls? And that really was the kind of kernel of the rest of my career, where I've really focused on how markets are driving sustainability decisions and how people are so central to those decisions.
You know, that's so funny. I wonder, one of these days I want to do a poll and find out how many people who work professionally in sustainability started as children who spent a lot of time outdoors, because that was absolutely my story. And I think a lot of people who are in this space, really experience the wonder of nature in a visceral way as we were growing up. And my journey was very similar to yours in that I started in environmental activism and worked on anti-logging campaigns, and we were losing badly. And I finally sort of went on this journey to be like, well, why are we cutting down the trees in the first place? Oh, we're cutting down the trees in the first place because we need food and fuel and timber and all of these things that the economy is really demanding and driving. And so it's just a fun set of parallels there. So after Borneo.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say what that led me then to think is that, okay, well, I'll go and work for an NGO, and I worked for World Wildlife Fund for a while, and I was able to work across Africa, 11 countries in Africa, and just really learn a lot about what were some of those constraints on how people were using and engaging with the forest. And I thought, what's going on here? I really don't understand this. We, the kind of environmental community, this was around the time of the first Earth Summit in Rio, and there was so much excitement, but it was like, why are we not making the change that we should be making? Why are we not seeing the results? And I was really struggling with that. And I thought, well, I need to understand this better. I need to really get to the truth behind this. And so I decided I'd go and do a PhD in environmental science. And I thought I would find the answer there. Of course, I didn't find the answer there. I did get a PhD, but I did not find that answer. And I thought, well, really then let me turn to kind of pragmatic action. And this was where it wasn't a case of like understanding theoretically how these kind of, market economic decisions were driving how resources were used, but rather like, how are businesses actually acting? How are they kind of operating through their global supply chains and sending those price signals, sending those incentives right the way through to the farmer on the product side, on the production side? And that's where I started to really want to hone in and engage with business more and more.
And that led you to Nike?
Well, yes, there are a few dots in between, but I basically finished my PhD in 2003 and I went looking for work. And I went back to the UK. I'd done my PhD at Berkeley. I went back to the UK and I started looking for work in this space. And I applied to tons of places. And no one wanted some upstart who had ideas about changing the world through business at that point. There was really no interest. And, I tried some of the big food companies. I tried some of the agricultural products companies. I tried some of the retail. Nothing going. And I thought, okay, how do I still keep this path in a different way? And I was fortunate, and Oxfam UK was looking for someone to lead their livelihood strategy. But really central to this was going to be moving beyond the campaign work with private sector into what could be win-win. So that's where I went. And I worked with many really interesting people in different companies, Cadbury's, Body Shop, Unilever. Did a lot of work with Unilever, trying to set up something that now is really important in the market, which is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And so working with the team there and the team at Oxfam and among many other companies and NGOs, we established this organization, which now more than 20% of the world's palm oil goes through. And it really was an opportunity for me to engage more directly with companies. And it just was absolutely even clearer to me that I wanted to get inside. I wanted to get inside the companies. I wanted to get into the plumbing, understand how it works. And so after about 7 years at Oxfam, I went on the next job hunt. And that led me to Nike.
So before we leave Oxfam, say a little more about the Sustainable Roundtable on palm oil, because I think that is, these public-private sort of nonprofit pressure/collaboration efforts, I think are really key to both unlocking action now and in the future, and have historically been the way in which we move these conversations forward. And I feel like sometimes once it's done, everybody's like, oh, that was easy. And now it's working great. And it almost never is, right? So tell us a little bit about that and what you learned from that experience of building these types of collaborative partnerships.
Yeah, they are hugely important. And one of the reasons why we wanted to set this up at the beginning is that the palm oil industry was rapaciously expanding, and it still expands, and it was cutting down pristine rainforest to do so. Pristine rainforest is one of the most important things for stabilizing our climate. It also yields massive amounts of biodiversity and is innately something that we need to value. So there was a sense among some of the kind of leading companies that they themselves wanted to do things differently. And there was a strong sense from the NGOs that businesses needed to operate differently. But it's a very, very complex system, from enormous multinationals through to seriously farmers that have 1 or 2 trees. And, all of the kind of contracting and sales and growth and all of this that goes in between is enormously complex, fraught with land use issues, labor issues, emissions issues, and now much more water issues, as well as biodiversity. And so what we wanted to do was create something that could be a starting point. And I think this was really important. I still remember the conversation that I had with the head of sustainable agriculture at Unilever, Yankees Fiss. And we sat down and said, look, what is the best way to approach this? Should we come in with the highest standards that we know are possible, that will be absolutely correct as far as biodiversity and land use and so on? Or should we try and come in and bring everyone we can into the tent and start a conversation about it and start at a point where the majority could get to. And, there are many, many experts who were involved in developing what that would look like. And that's where we started from. What is something that is good enough to get going, that is still reaching? We didn't drop ambition, but it's still reaching, but it's possible to reach it and then go beyond. And we decided on that, setting the bar and then progressively moving the bar up, or progressively widening what we were covering, so that we weren't, we could add on. How do you do your supply chain when you're expanding in West Africa? How are you expanding your consideration of water issues, which have become more recently important? And so those things were really critical. And it was critical for us to understand that these businesses, if they were here at the table, they wanted to engage. And if we set something that was going to get them, leave the tent, walk away from the table, there would be another company that would come in and do perhaps even worse. So what we wanted to do was to really create that conversation space and work together to define something that would be good for the environment and good for business and good for labor practices too.
This is such an important question, I think, for us as the environmental community, and as we're, operating in this kind of moment in time now, but also just always, right? I feel like we have this war within ourselves about, do we come in and do we demand perfection from the outset, or do we set the bar really high because we're in a climate crisis, or, we have a palm oil crisis? Like, let's actually solve the problem completely and in the best way that we know science is telling us we need to. Or let's come in, let's open the conversation, let's figure out where those first steps are and ratchet from there. And of course, the concern is always that you don't actually end up ratcheting, right? And so in that process, what actually ended up happening? Were you guys able to move progressively more ambition through that collaborative process?
We absolutely were. Not only were we able to kind of ratchet up, but we were also able to get much more of the market inside. And so you think about, what you're ratcheting up is both a kind of improvement direction, but also a scope direction, so that, you have more that are moving up. And so if you want to look at your total impact, you have to look at those dimensions at the same time. But there's another piece of this, which is equally important, is that all of this work generates a lot of insight. When you have people aligning on what information they're going to provide, you start to be able to then compare those data and say, oh, this company is doing really well financially. Their growth is good, or their financials are good. At the same time, they're doing these sustainability things. So those sustainability things, we're going to assume, are playing part of that financial revenue return, right? And so what you start to get is greater insight into what works for both the bottom line and for the planet. And I think that is something that we are seeing a lot more in a lot of these standards and a lot of these disclosure areas. Right now, it feels like this huge overwhelm of data and requirements. But soon we're going to get to a point where how we operate in that space and data collection and reporting is more normalized. And we'll be able to see some of these incredible insights around what drives business value at the same time as climate value, or indeed what drives business value through addressing climate.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And actually, the disclosure sort of story is a really good one to point to as well, because I remember when we first started talking to companies about measuring their greenhouse gas footprints, and they were just like, I'm sorry, what? Like, why would we do that? Right. And so it was years of engagement with them about, no, you can't manage what you don't measure, and measurement is foundational. And now it's just assumed that everyone is reporting on an annual basis. And I mean, that's an example of a place where we've made huge progress just in normalizing what was originally something that felt like a pretty tall ask for a lot of companies. And so it's a great illustration of just how you can build momentum towards that kind of market norming over time if you get enough critical mass in the market kind of adopting it. Because I think, and I'd love to hear your views on this, but my observation of most companies is they want to be in the middle of the pack, right? And they want to be kind of following the herd. A few of them want that leadership mantle, but most of them do not. And so Nike is an interesting example because it's a company that's done a lot for many years across its supply chain, and it's done things, I think, pretty quietly and without a lot of fanfare often. So talk a little bit about that and how that transition worked for you.
Yeah, well, the transition was super interesting because, as I said, I got to that point where I really wanted to get inside, and I started looking at different opportunities. And I applied for a job at Nike. I did an interview. I then got a phone call from Hannah Jones, who's the person who brought me into Nike. She was the trailblazing CSO. And she said, "You didn't get the job." Then she paused for a moment, and my heart fell. And she said, "But we want you. We need to figure out how to bring you in. We're going to create a role for you." And she said, Mark Parker, who was the CEO at that time, absolutely brilliant CEO, he was really questioning, when we look at the labor in the contract manufacturing, of course, Nike has a few small factories for particular things, but it does its production through contract manufacturers. And so you look at that, he said, are we actually engaging in the right way with our contract manufacturers and their workers? And so Hannah basically asked me, can you respond to this? Can you come in, address that question that Mark is posing for our whole organization? And, my answer was no. We are not going about this the right way because we are leaving value on the table by not valuing the workers enough. So if we value the workers, and you could say if we value climate or value other resources, right? If we value that, then we are going to get a return. And this is where that's the basic premise that I took forward to Nike in the supply chain work around labor issues. And it panned out. And I remember actually presenting one time, and Phil Knight, who of course started Nike and is such a thoughtful, creative business mind, he said, "But isn't this going to cost us more money? I mean, why do we have to invest in sustainability when it's going to cost us more? What is the return we're going to get?" And I said, "Yeah, it will cost us at the beginning, but our return is going to be greater." And that's where we start to change the narrative to thinking about it as something you put in an upfront cost in the same way that you would think about building a new innovation in how you're producing shoes. And it was a very different way to think about labor, certainly. And it really kind of led to some fantastic results. I mean, some of these very simple innovations that we did, that, by the way, now are scaled across the industry. Nike was deploying them in about 80% of product that was made, in the sites that made about 80% of the product. These were returning, 19% uplift in productivity, 7 or 8% uplift in quality and in the agility. And if we think about agility, that's a very, very important business driver. And what agility means in the manufacturing space is being able to switch from one product to another, one technique to another. And when you have a lot of volatility in markets, where you can sell goods, how your supply chain is operating, where logistical constraints are, you need the producers, in this case, the workers in these contract factories, to be able to do multiple things. And so this investment in people actually drove a lot of sustainability improvements for their own lives, and also drove a lot of improvements and positive benefits from the business perspective.
Nike obviously has a vast, highly distributed supply chain that they have relatively low amounts of control over. And so talk a little more about how you engaged your sort of middle tier suppliers and the folks who were actually making the decisions on the ground, and how you helped influence them to change the way in which they behaved with workers, and particularly in markets where there are both very real cultural and economic headwinds when it comes to valuing labor and workers' rights. It's not a given in many of those places in the way that we sort of pretend it is here in the United States, right?
It's true. It's true. And it's true that the supply chain is one step removed from the company. But there are really important ways in which Nike and other leading companies engage their supply chain. And that engagement of the supply chain is wrought through contracts, is wrought through supplier summits where there's technical assistance shared. It's wrought through the engagement of developing a new product where you have, folks on both sides going back and forth and discussing and making decisions about what materials to use or when this gets shipped for a particular market. And those kinds of decisions that companies take actually then shape how those manufacturers respond. And one of the really important ways that Nike does this, and this has been published, and there's in fact a great case study on global sourcing at Nike done by Harvard Business School. I was very heavily involved in that. Mike Toffel and Nian-Ha Shi wrote that. The manufacturing index. So the manufacturing index is this key tool, and this is something that Nike uses. As I said, it's out there. This is published. This is not confidential information, but it's also something that a lot of other leading companies use. And what you're trying to do is look at your cost, quality, delivery, and sustainability. And you put that in a matrix because, of course, you need to work with suppliers that are cost efficient, that can deliver on time, that the product is good quality, and that at a minimum, they're meeting the sustainable compliance requirements, but hopefully actually investing for some of those longer term returns as well. And as companies like Nike engage their supply chain, they're able to say, we're looking for all of these factors, not just you can do it the cheapest, not just you can get it to me the fastest, but are you reaching these sustainability requirements that we have, that our brand wants to see or perhaps even sell to our customers, to tell them about what we're doing, or that we know is going to be a risk mitigation or value capture opportunity for us. Or at a minimum is placing just a role of kind of license to operate in those particular countries. You asked about the kind of the middle road group of suppliers, not those top tier strategic folks. The middle ones often will follow what the top ones have done.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
And so it becomes easier if you engage with your top tier strategic suppliers and they're moving the needle forward on these things in country. They all know one another. They have, kind of in various engagements together. They have workers who move from one factory to the next. And that kind of definitely sets a culture of what is expected in particular supply chains and working with particular brands.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And let's talk about this manufacturing index for a minute, because I think this is super interesting. And I'm actually always amazed and slightly surprised pleasantly at how responsive companies are to these types of metrics and indicators, right? Like having that public, hopefully relatively objective sort of set of metrics and kind of scorecards seems to be a very effective way to get people to pay attention to certain issues and also start to set those threshold benchmark quality requirements that we really care about across a wide variety of issues. So talk a little more about that. Did Nike do that itself, or was there an independent third-party nonprofit that was involved in designing that?
I actually don't know the answer to that because that was before my time. And I started there in 2010, and that was already it. I think it was in place. Been built before that. Yeah.
Okay.
But my sense is that it was homegrown. It wasn't NGOs. Definitely wasn't NGOs saying do this. It was definitely about the company. I mean, any operations person is going to look at cost, quality, delivery.
Sure.
And putting it together with sustainability was the kind of key critical piece. And I think that there was a big reorg just before I arrived, so 2008. And that's when a lot of these sustainability investments started to be made. And that's when I think the sustainability piece was added to the manufacturing index.
Such a critical point, too, is being able to hook sustainability metrics and indicators onto systems and programs that already exist and that are core business in a company is so important.
It's one of the most important things.
Yeah.
The question when you have something like the manufacturing index or any company's equivalent is, so what? If you get those data, what are you going to do about it? What is that kind of next piece that makes a decision? It's very hard to make a decision after getting the data from something like a manufacturing index. In reality, are you going to say, okay, well, I'm not going to work with this supplier anymore? Well, how is that going to be possible when that supplier might make the one thing that you need, the one widget for your machine that you're making and selling? And you have to kind of roll off them, or you choose, are you going to go with a different supplier if you can find it, or are you going to build their capability? And those are the kind of choices that this manufacturing index would actually help you make. But you have to have that internal desire to act on that information. And that's a really key thing, is not just creating the tools, but actually then having the governance around decisions to take action.
And you did, in that experience and process in your time at Nike, you were involved in establishing another kind of industry sector specific set of benchmarks and standards, correct?
The apparel and retail sector is an interesting one. It's been going for so many years, producing clothes and garments and shoes and products every day that we use, right? All of it using different auditing systems. So in order to operate your manufacturing site, in order for a brand to sell their goods, they usually have a code of conduct. And in that code of conduct, it requires that they do an audit. And for compliance reasons, in whatever governance setting they're operating in or where they're selling, it requires that they have an audit to show certain labor practices are met, or now more recently, some environmental standards are met. However, what was happening in the apparel sector is that you had so many different kinds of audits, and each of the NGOs that had these audits thought that their audit was the best. And the problem was with that, I mean, full kudos to everyone to getting this going. But when you then got to a point of maturity in the industry where you had so many different audits, what was happening is that each manufacturer might choose a different audit to use, or might be required by their brand to use that different audit. So you might be in a factory where there are 10 different audits being used for 10 different buyers, 10 different brands that are buying from that factory. What that means is that management in that factory is constantly responding to these different audits, rather than saying, how do we build for the future? How do we invest in change that is beyond compliance? And this is one of the problems that we were trying to solve in bringing together a group of industry actors to say, how do we align on one audit for the industry? Why is that important? It's not just that the manufacturers themselves need to act and they need to stop arguing over where the fire extinguisher is for company 1 and it's 3 inches lower for company 2 and it's in next to the bathroom for company 3. And this is total reality. What we needed was a sense that you could trust these data, that you could actually feel confident as a brand that you had insight into whether these manufacturers were actually complying with the law, but also that you had line of sight into something that you could feel you could convey to your customers, and that you could feel that this confidence would give you security in your market. And these pain points, these various pain points around manufacturers kind of going further than compliance and investing in sustainability activities, but then also that kind of confidence to be able to convey this information to the customers, really drove a desire for an alignment. And Nike said, okay, let's actually try to kickstart that. It had been going 20 years in the industry with all of these different audit tools out there. Our job was to figure out how we could actually get this alignment. So I was lucky enough to stand up this collaboration among 15 or 16 or 17 different companies, retail, apparel, fashion, footwear, across Europe and America, to say, yeah, we will actually decide that we will use that, and we will ask our contract manufacturers to use one audit, the same audit in the industry. Everyone, of course, is still being competitive, and everyone is still using their own code of conduct to assess that audit, but they're going to use that one audit so that we're talking about the same data. And this is really critical for when we talk about standards as well, is that if you have so many different adjudications of what good looks like and so many different views on what companies should do, it is frankly hard for companies to know what to do. But it is also very easy for those who don't want to do anything to basically go, oh, it's too confusing. And so neither end wins. So alignment around standards that can be clear, can be doable, is what we're really after. And that's what we try to set up.
I mean, that's exactly the moment we're in right now with greenhouse gas accounting standards. And I think one of the reasons that we stood up the Task Force for Corporate Action Transparency, right, was just getting that like foundational benchmark, which of course CDF has been a key partner in, is just what is that threshold benchmark for transparency, for comparability, for getting everybody on the same page in terms of the information they're reporting, and then layering on top over time what we think right looks like and what quality requirements are. So tell me a little bit about how that past history and the amazing work you've done over the course of your career is informing the work you're doing now at EDF and some of the exciting projects you're working on today.
Well, I think one of the things that I'm finding very, very powerful is not just that short term that we were talking about, the cost quality delivery, but also the long-term financial model. What I've learned about how companies drive change and how they take on sustainability to drive change is that it has to be in the interest of the business. It absolutely has to be something, and this is really critical, that it will drive value. A lot of times we focus on sustainability as cost saving. We're going to reduce water costs. We're going to reduce energy costs. But what we're seeing right now as greater stringency in markets is held around carbon. So you're having to report if you go into the European market, if you're in a high polluting industry right now with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Wow, that is absolutely enormous. The impact is just profound at the moment. And companies that have invested in innovations that will allow them to say, yep, we've got pretty low carbon in our aluminium, in our cement, in our fertilizer, they can go in and they're doing fine. But the ones that are high carbon intensity, they are really suffering right now because the levies that they're facing are huge. So if you look back, you go, oh, wow, we really should have invested in innovations or in technologies that are going to allow us to enter in these markets. And what does that mean? That's value capture. They are getting a larger share of those markets, and they will be able to say, yes, we can keep innovating. They've started on that path, and they're going to be leapfrog ahead because they've already started that innovation pathway. Whereas others will be pushed out and are being pushed out of that market. And, you know, they could be selling in other markets and end up dumping a lot of carbon into those other markets. So what I expect is also that will lead to a kind of race to a top on those policies where each of these markets don't want to be dumped all that bad carbon, right? Yeah. And so companies are then thinking, how do I do this? This is not a kind of immediate, like, I'm making this decision about my logistics supply. Am I going to go through Panama? Am I going to go across the country in the US with a truck? These are things that are longer term plays. These are understandings of like where markets are growing. What types of products do I want to put into those markets? What is my long-term financial model going to show me that I can confidently go in front of investors, that I can confidently share with my shareholders about expected growth?
Yeah.
And the more they're able to put sustainability in there, what we're seeing is that it's tighter and tighter aligned with good business.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you make a couple of really important points. And one of them, I think, is the value of optionality.
Yeah.
Right. Like CBAM, I mean, the EU threatened for years and years and years to put border tariffs on. We resisted them at the US. People said, please don't, please don't, please don't. And they finally said, we are done waiting for the rest of you guys to put a price on carbon. This is happening. And they had to, right, because of internal domestic pressure as well. But for those companies that have made that investment, and I really learned this at Netflix, you don't just flip a switch and decarbonize your supply chain or your operations, right? There's no like, oh, today we're high emitting, tomorrow we're low emitting. It's a years-long journey to basically pull through all of the operational changes that are required to integrate new technologies, to change the business practices, to help people understand that like, oh yeah, you're going to have to change the way you think about your driving truck patterns because you have to charge your EV instead of stopping for 10 minutes and filling it up. But that's okay because you have a mandated rest anyways. And so just align them, right? But that's a whole sort of policy and internal management and frankly, culture shift that these companies have to go through. And I think that having started that journey and just sort of steady as she goes is going to be incredibly important for those companies where we're in a highly unpredictable political and regulatory environment right now. Well, so tell me a little bit about that Hearts and Minds strategy, and how, that's what I call it, because it's what it felt like, right? We were trying to win the hearts and minds of all of the people across the entire company that we basically had to convince to both take risks on new approaches, new technologies, new ways of doing business, but also like we needed to get them enlisted in the cause. Like we needed them to be excited and willing to actually kind of do a little extra work or go out of their way, or, and a lot of times they would try it and they'd come back and they'd say, wow, this is so much better. At Nike, what was your strategy around engaging those hearts and minds? And how do we really think about that culture aspect of the transition and making sure that it's integrated into the work and strategy that we do?
I mean, I think the most important thing is really understanding what's in it for the people that you're engaging. And I think understanding the culture of a particular company. Every company has different ways of acting, ways of making decisions. They place different kind of value on different parts of the organization, different teams, and understanding who are the decision makers about whatever action it is that you're trying to do. That, I think, is the critical thing. Who makes those decisions? Mm-hmm. And then what's the kind of culture around them that you need to understand? If you are trying to make change, come in with understanding their perspective, understanding where their pain points are and what the solutions are that are culturally okay in their company, and then work as hard as possible to build your kind of value in talking about sustainability from their perspective. And I think this is where it is very, very difficult to have, sustainability projects kind of lobbed over to procurement teams or logistics teams and so on. If you start rather from like, what is your pain point, person in procurement? What is your pain point, person in logistics? While in mind, you're having this big picture direction that you're trying to go, you're able to bring some of those things and build along the way the kind of culture of understanding how actually addressing sustainability, addressing climate issues is a very good path towards sometimes immediate short-term gains and definitely longer-term ones.
Yeah, I think that's all exactly right. In terms of, so I think the hearts and minds conversation, it's not just the people inside of the company too, right? It's the whole sort of ecosystem of actors that we engage in sustainability. So it's civil society, it's funders and the philanthropic community, it's governments. And, the last few years, I think particularly in what I'll gently characterize as the net zero wars, I think is really illustrated where when you don't have an aligned vision and view across these key stakeholders, then the whole sort of system falls apart, which frankly, I think is close to where we are with net zero. So talk a little bit about just how you see that whole conversation evolving and some of the work you're doing in that space now, because I know you do a lot there.
I actually think that, this is the bad news. The bad news is that climate change is hitting. And because climate change is hitting, that's also the good news from the perspective of getting companies to act, because it is immediately relevant right now. This is no longer a conversation where you have to inveigle some explanation of why it's important. This is really hitting bottom line. We're already seeing predictions this year. I mean, and it's building on previous years, shipping costs expected to increase by about 10%. We know that a couple of years ago when Panama Canal had a substantial drought, that at least a third of their throughput was reduced. And with, multiple hundreds of millions of pounds lost and dollars lost, we know that these things are just immediately felt at the minute. And so companies are having to act. And so I feel that, and this is where my team and I are really leaning in, is that this is not something that we actually need to do as much of convincing. It's about getting to action because they're already on board. They're already on board with like, how do I solve this? Because man, it's hitting my bottom line. I can see it.
Yeah.
And that is a really good place. But this also means that we better get out of our own way as NGOs. We absolutely have to enable action, and we really need to enable action quickly. So that means simplifying in a way that allows us to move as quickly as possible, aligning where we can, and really understanding like, what is that big goal that we're trying to get to, and how do we move there in a stepwise fashion? It's okay to be modular. And there's a last piece of this, which is that always we need to be connecting to where innovation is taking us. If we think about the world today, we are not the same as we were even a couple of years ago in terms of the kinds of technologies that we have and the price points around them. Solar, wind, they're down, 90 and 60% compared to 10 or so years ago. We have AI now with all of the efficiencies of what solutions it can bring. I'm not going to talk about all of the impact in terms of the energy demand, but what solutions it can bring. We also have the kinds of, whether it's, smelting technologies or other kinds of carbon intensity measures that can be really pushed forward on value creation. And this is where I think we're going to see this move from really being companies acting because it's hitting their bottom line on cost, right? On that risk factor. But they're also more and more, particularly as we see these reporting requirements across big governments, they're going to see the need for that move to capture value, capture market share. And that's where the investments are going to be going.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot of movement still. I guess in the US, though, we're in sort of a unique moment of political headwinds.
Yes. Yes.
How are you seeing things kind of moving forward, given the moment in time we're in geopolitically?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, the first is that stuff is still going on. It's just not being talked about. And this is what we're hearing this day in, day out. Yeah, we're still doing it. We're not talking about it publicly. Now, mostly that's okay. I mean, it's not the end of the world. However, we mustn't forget that companies are also, it's a conglomeration of employees, and those employees really care about the environment more and more so. I mean, it's, by far the majority of employees want to see their companies act on sustainability, act on climate. And so actually setting targets is a profoundly important thing to say, here is our intention. This is what we're trying to do, right? And so setting targets, particularly around hard things like Scope 3, do it, move it forward, even if you're keeping it internal, but hopefully you can transparently state those as well. That is needed. But the reality today is that it is a hard environment. It is very volatile in terms of those costs that we were talking about earlier. It's very volatile in terms of the policy environment. And companies need to protect themselves to kind of keep moving forward. That's totally understandable. But it's absolutely being worked on. Climate is absolutely being worked on today. That gives me a lot of hope in the US. We saw a little bit of regression also in Europe, but the work is still happening in that same way. But really critically too, a lot of these global companies, they set the tone in their sectors. They are market leaders in their sectors. And by the way, they're also global companies. And so they're operating in India, they're operating in other parts of Asia, they're operating in South America, Africa, Central America. And that means that because it is a waste of time to have one measure for Europe and one measure for America and one measure for Africa, they're actually making changes in how they operate globally. And this means that because they are global companies, they are going to be acting on climate because it's in their interest from running their business.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I always like to end these conversations with a positive note, which I think you're doing. But what are you feeling most hopeful about these days? And what is keeping you in the fight after what has been, I know, many years of doing this work in the trenches?
I mean, I am really, really excited right now. I actually feel like despite the fact that we are living in a very sad, very distressing moment in the world, I'm actually very hopeful for the world that we're building. I think there is really this opportunity for building it together in a way that's more equitable and definitely more green, where we are living in a world that attends to the climate. And I just think that we have all these pieces in place. We have such massive momentum with the burgeoning use of electricity and that new world that we're creating there. We have so much that's moving forward on reporting and carbon, driving all the kinds of investments that we're talking about. We are taking action on methane, which is critical in the short term. And we are really thinking about new ways to solve problems. And so all of those things I think are really good. I feel like we've got a good future ahead of us. We've just got to kind of keep moving. Don't be intimidated. Get action going. And think about it as good for the business, because it is.
Yeah, I totally agree. I see a real moment in time and an opportunity for us to just kind of double down and get the work done, fix the problems that need to be fixed, build the systems the way we know they need to be built in order to be durable and functional in the real world, and really be ready to hit the ground running, building on all this good momentum we've collectively built over the last few years. So thank you for your work. Thank you for taking time to chat with me today. I've really enjoyed the conversation and look forward to speaking again soon. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Alexia. Good to be here.
That's it for this episode of Navigating Net Zero. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to follow or subscribe, and help us spread the word by sharing this episode with your friends and colleagues. Thank you for listening. Until next time, be well and keep up the great work.